Because if she refuses to eat the food of the land or rest her head like a mortal, then she deserves the darkness that is coming for her. When the most beautiful woman named Dara arrives in Ayami village, the men are blinded by her unreal figure and hair that falls in soft waves. But as the days pass, a terrifying whisper chills the market square. Dara has never been seen to take a single bite of food, and the lamp in her hut never goes out through the midnight watch. She rejects every man, from the lowly fisherman to the powerful Prince Deji, claiming she needs no man to provide for her. Suspicion soon turns to a hunger for ruin. Even her friend Funk, consumed by a jealousy she cannot name, decides that if Dara will not be human, she must be a monster. Funk conspires with 3 bitter men, Kola, Ao, and Tundi, to break into the hut and unmask the terrifying reason for her silence. But they could never have imagined what would happen, because Dara is not just any girl. She was never a woman to be conquered, she was a final test sent from the depths of the river. Before I tell you the terrifying thing they saw when they burst through her door, please like and subscribe. I also want to know where you are watching from. Are you in Africa, or somewhere like London, America, or Germany? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Dara arrived in Ayami village on a warm afternoon when the sun hung low and heavy in the sky. She was the kind of person whose arrival could not be missed, moving through the dust of the entrance path with a grace that seemed to defy the rugged terrain. Her long hair fell down her back in soft waves, shimmering with a luster that no local oils could produce. Her lips were full and gently rosy, as though they had never known the parching dryness of the harmattan winds. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled the onlookers. They were large and bright, the kind that seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if she were seeing a world invisible to the mortal eye. Even beneath the loose wrapper tied around her body, her figure was unreal, possessing a symmetry that felt sculpted by divine hands rather than born of flesh. When she stepped into the market square, the rhythmic pulse of trade stopped instantly. Women paused mid-sentence, and traders forgot to call out their prices, their mouths hanging open in silent wonder. Even old Babatala, whose back had been bent for so many years that he rarely lifted his head from the dirt, straightened his spine slowly and stared as she passed, his ancient eyes widening at a beauty he could not name. It was safe to say the entire village was taken aback, yet Dara did not announce herself or smile for the attention she had commanded. She did not look around to see who was watching, for her beauty spoke loudly enough on its own. She walked with a calm, eerie purpose until she stopped in front of Mama Gold, one of the oldest elders in the village. "Please, Ma," Dara said, her voice sounding like the soft chime of water against stone, "is there any hut available for me to stay in?" Mama Gold stared at her a moment longer than necessary, her seasoned eyes searching the girl's face for a flicker of something human. Finally, she pointed her walking stick toward the edge of the village near the palm grove. Dara thanked her politely and walked away, her movements fluid and silent. As she disappeared toward her new home, Mama Gold frowned, a half-forgotten feeling tugging at her chest. There was a perfection in Dara that felt hollow, a beauty so absolute it lacked the bone and grit of a living, breathing woman. She was respectful and soft-spoken, but there was a coldness in her perfection that whispered of things better left undisturbed. As Dara settled into the edge of the village, the air in Ayami began to change, thick with a mixture of desire and growing resentment. It did not take long for the men to gather like flies around a honey pot. At first, they came with gifts and gentle words, trying to entice the beautiful stranger who never seemed to eat or sleep. Kul the fisherman offered his best catch, and Ade the trader promised a life of comfort and protection, but to each, Dara gave the same calm, unwavering refusal. She did not seek to offend, yet her silence and her lack of interest unsettled them more than a loud argument ever could. The tension reached its peak on a day when the sun was high and the market was bustling. Prince Deji, the pride of the village and a man who had never known the word no, decided it was time to claim what he believed was his due. He approached Dara's hut with the confidence of a lion, dressed in his finest robes, with the eyes of the entire village following his every step. The villagers held their breath, certain that no woman, not even one as unreal as Dara, could turn away a prince. "You are very beautiful," the prince said, his voice smooth and heavy with entitlement. He did not ask, he commanded attention, glancing dismissively at those who stood nearby. But Dara did not flinch. She looked through him with those large, bright eyes that seemed to see a truth he could not comprehend. With a voice as cool as a mountain stream, she declined his advances just as she had declined the commoners. The prince stood frozen, a slap to his ego that resonated through the silent crowd. As he walked away with a tight jaw and burning eyes, the whispers began to transform. The admiration that had greeted Dara's arrival soured into a bitter curiosity. "Who does she think she is?" Kola scoffed later that evening by the fire. "She acts as if she is made of gold," Aio added, his voice dripping with venom. The rumor spread like wildfire through the huts. Dara was not just a stranger, she was a woman of unbearable pride, who looked down on the very people who offered her a home. In the eyes of the village, her refusal was no longer a choice, it was a challenge that the men of Ayami felt they had to win. As the days bled into weeks, the mystery of Dara began to settle over Ayami like a thick, unbreathable fog. While the men nursed their bruised egos in the village squares, it was Funk who found herself truly haunted by the girl's presence. She had positioned herself as Dara's only friend, helping her pick beans and peel oranges in the cool of the evening. But beneath her helpful smiles, a dark obsession was taking root. Funk was not looking for companionship, she was looking for a crack in the porcelain perfection of the woman who had captured every eye in the village. The villagers had noticed the beauty, but Funk began to notice the impossibilities. She realized that she had never seen Dara's cooking fire dance with the blue smoke of a morning meal, nor had she ever seen the girl draw water to quench a midday thirst. Driven by a restless, burning need to prove that Dara was as flawed as any other mortal, Funk decided to undertake a midnight watch. Under the shroud of a moonless night, Funk crept toward the edge of the village where the small hut sat near the palm grove. She hid herself in the tall grass, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected to see the lamp flicker out, she expected to hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of a woman lost to sleep. But the hours crawled by, and the golden glow from Dara's window remained steady and unwavering, slicing through the darkness like a defiant blade. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the lamp inside the hut did not dim. Through a small gap in the mud walls, Funk's eyes widened in a mixture of awe and terror. Dara was not lying on her mat. She was standing in the center of the room, her back straight and her eyes wide open, staring into the nothingness with a clarity that no human could maintain after a night of vigil. She did not blink, she did not sway. She stood as a statue might, waiting for a signal that only she could hear. Funk scrambled back into the shadows, her breath shallow and cold. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Dara was not merely proud, and she was not merely strange. She was something that did not belong to the cycle of the sun and the moon. The lamp had never gone out because the woman inside never closed her eyes to the world. Shaking with a new, jagged kind of fear, Funk realized that the untouched woman was not resting, she was watching the village just as intently as the village was watching her. The seeds of fear that Funk had planted began to grow into a thicket of dark accusations that choked the air of Ayami village. The news of the midnight watch spread from woman to woman at the stream and from man to man beneath the shade of the baobab trees. It was no longer just a matter of pride or a woman being difficult, the mystery had curdled into something far more dangerous. If Dara did not eat the fruits of the earth and if she did not close her eyes to the world, then the villagers reasoned she could not be of the earth at all. "She is a witch," Kola spat one evening as the shadows of the huts grew long and jagged. "She watches us while we sleep so she can steal our breath." The others nodded, their previous lust now replaced by a cold, defensive malice. They began to recount small, insignificant events and twist them into omens of doom. A goat that had fallen ill was now Dara's doing, a sudden dry spell in the clouds was her curse. The curiosity that had greeted her arrival had fully transformed into a collective arrogance that demanded she be punished for her strangeness. Funk moved among the men like a ghost, her voice a low, steady poison. She no longer spoke of friendship, only of the wickedness she claimed to have seen in that glowing hut. She gathered Kola, Ao, and Tundi in a secluded corner of the marketplace, away from the watchful eyes of Mama Gold and the other elders. She thinks she is above our laws because she serves a darker master, Funk whispered, her eyes burning with a redirected shame. She rejects our men because she is already wed to the shadows. The men, fueled by their bruised egos and the prince's public humiliation, listened with a hunger that was no longer about love, but about control. The wicked plan began to take shape under the cover of their shared resentment. They decided that Dara's spirit had to be broken to protect the village, or so they told themselves to mask their desire for revenge. They would not wait for the elders to deliberate or for the goddess to speak. They would take the matter into their own hands, planning to corner the untouched woman when she was most vulnerable, convinced that by exposing her a flaw, they would finally reclaim the power she had so calmly taken from them. In the dark corners of Ayami, the village was no longer a community, it had become a predator waiting for the moon to rise. The opportunity arrived on a cool evening when the air was unnaturally still and the usual nightly chorus of insects had fallen into an uneasy silence. Funk approached the small hut near the palm grove, her footsteps light but her heart thudding against her ribs with the weight of her betrayal. In her hands, she carried a small calabash cup filled with a fruit drink she had prepared with meticulous, wicked care. It was sweet and fragrant, masked by the scents of the forest, but hidden within its depths was a potent mixture designed to strip a mortal of their senses. She knocked softly on the wooden door, her voice pitched in a tone of false, airy kindness. "My friend," Funk called out when Dara opened the door, "I am testing a new recipe and I thought you might help me decide if it is good." Dara stood in the doorway, her presence as ethereal and unreal as the day she had first stepped into the market square. She glanced down at the cup, and for a fleeting, breathless moment, a strange expression flickered across her face, one that Funk could not name or understand. Dara's bright eyes lingered on the liquid for longer than necessary, as if she were not looking at the drink, but listening to it. In that silence, it seemed as though her spirit senses were vibrating, weighing the malice hidden in the offering against the purpose of her mission. Funk's breath caught in her throat, she was certain that the untouched woman saw through the ruse and would cast the drink aside. But Dara's gaze finally drifted back to Funk's face, filled with a calm, terrible clarity. With a slow, deliberate movement, Dara nodded and accepted the cup. She invited Funk inside, and as they sat together in the dim light of the hut, Dara lifted the offering to her lips. She took slow, measured sips, her eyes never leaving Funk's as she finished the very last drop. "So," Funk asked, her voice trembling as she forced a jagged smile, "do you like it?" Dara opened her mouth to speak, her voice sounding like the distant rush of a river. "Honestly, Funk," she began, but the words cut off abruptly as the world tilted beneath her. The celestial test had reached its turning point. Dara swayed once, then collapsed onto the floor, her eyes finally closing as she surrendered to the darkness the village had chosen to provide. The heavy thud of Dara's body hitting the earthen floor was the signal the men had been waiting for in the shadows of the palm grove. Funk stepped to the door, her face a mask of cold triumph as she waved Kola, Ao, and Tundi forward. They moved like vultures toward a fallen lamb, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of predatory intent and the desire to finally humiliate the woman who had dared to be untouchable. "The pride is gone now," Kola whispered, his voice thick with a jagged, ugly excitement. "Let us see what this gold is really made of." They burst through the door with a violence that shook the mud walls, ready to drag the unconscious girl into the center of the village to satisfy their curiosity and their spite. But as they reached for her, the air in the small hut began to hum with a low, vibrating frequency that made the hair on their arms stand upright. The lamp, which had burned steadily for weeks, suddenly flared with a brilliance that blinded them, its flame turning from a warm orange to a sharp, electric blue. A gasp escaped Funk's throat as she stumbled back. Dara was no longer lying still. Her body began to rise from the floor, suspended by an invisible force, and the darkness of the room was shattered by an explosion of white light so pure it felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests. The men cried out, shielding their eyes, but they could not look away from the terrifying beauty unfolding before them. With the sound of rushing water, Dara's human form began to unravel. The unreal skin that had captivated the village cracked and peeled away like dry parchment, revealing not flesh and bone, but a body made of shimmering, translucent light. Her hair transformed into cascading waves of liquid silver, and her eyes, once merely bright, became twin suns that burned with an ancient, celestial knowledge. The wrapper she wore dissolved into a mist of blue vapor, leaving her standing before them as a towering, ethereal spirit of the river. The men fell to their knees, their arrogance vanishing in an instant as the hut seemed to expand into an infinite, watery void. The air grew cold and smelled of deep, forgotten currents. The terrifying reason was finally clear. Dara had never eaten because she was the river's lifeblood, and she had never slept because she was the witness to every sin committed on the land. The predatory grin was gone from Kola's face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as the spirit looked down at them, her voice no longer a chime, but a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of their souls. The test was over, and the judgment of Ayami had begun. The spirit that was once Dara did not move her lips, yet a voice like the grinding of ancient river stones filled the hut, vibrating in the very marrow of the conspirators' bones. The air grew heavy and damp, smelling of old silt and stagnant water, as the walls of the hut seemed to dissolve into a swirling mist of memories. "You look upon me with terror," the spirit intoned, her eyes burning like twin moons reflected in a dark pool, "yet you do not recognize the face of the debt you owe. You believe your cruelty today is a new thing, but the river remembers what the earth has tried to forget." As she spoke, the mist thickened, forming ghostly shapes that acted out a tragedy from a century before. The men and Funk watched, paralyzed, as the image of a woman named BC appeared, a woman who had once been as beautiful and as misunderstood as Dara. They saw their ancestors, a mob of angry men with the same features as Kola, Ao, and Tundi, cornering BC by the riverbank. They saw the same entitlement, the same jagged jealousy in the eyes of a woman who looked exactly like Funk, as they accused BC of witchcraft simply because she would not submit to their will. 100 years ago, this soil drank the blood of an innocent, the spirit's voice thundered, causing the ground to tremble. BC begged for mercy, but your forefathers gave her only the cold embrace of the current. They buried the truth, thinking the water would wash away their sin. But the river does not wash, it preserves. The spirit stepped closer, her translucent form casting no shadow, only a cold, shimmering light. She pointed a finger of liquid silver at each of them in turn. "You, Kola, carry the blood of the man who held her down. You, Tundi and Ao, are the seeds of those who threw the first stones. And you, Funk," the spirit paused, her gaze piercing through the woman's soul, "you are the living breath of the girl who wove the lies that led her to the water. I was sent to see if the blood had thinned, if the heart of Ayami had finally learned to honor a woman's soul. But I found only the same rot, the same hunger to break what you cannot own." The revelation hit them with the force of a tidal wave. They weren't just men who had made a mistake, they were the walking echoes of an ancient evil, caught in a cycle of violence they had unknowingly restarted. The terrifying reason for Dara's presence was finally laid bare. She was the ghost of their past, returned to collect a price that had been accruing interest for generations. The spirit's form expanded, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of impending judgment, as the memories of the river began to drown the last of their hope. As the spirit's final words echoed into the night, a sudden, unnatural heat descended upon Ayami, a searing breath that seemed to suck the moisture from the very air. The shimmering spirit of Dara began to fade into a fine, blue mist, but the weight of her presence did not leave. Outside the hut, the village was plunged into a nightmare. By the time the sun climbed over the horizon the next morning, it was no longer the golden orb of life, but a vengeful eye that scorched the earth. The first scream came from the banks of the river. The women who had gone to draw their morning water found only a deep, jagged scar where the life-giving stream had once flowed. The water had not merely receded, it had been replaced by a thick, bubbling mud the color of dried blood, emitting a stench of rot that made the strongest men retch. The fish lay gasping and bloated in the sludge, their silver scales turning to ash in the relentless heat. The thirsty land had arrived, and it was a hunger that could not be satisfied. As the days passed, the curse spread its roots deep into the soil. The lush palm groves that had once provided shade and oil withered into skeletal husks, their fronds turning brown and brittle. The yam crops, the pride of Ayami, rotted within the parched earth, turning to dust before they could be harvested. Thirst became a physical animal that clawed at the throats of the elders and the children alike. Even the goats and cattle, once the mark of a man's wealth, began to collapse in the dust, their ribcages poking through their hides like the bars of a cage. Desperate, the village elders sent messengers to the neighboring villages, begging for water and grain. But the curse was a wall that no plea could breach. When the messengers reached the borders of the next town, they found the gates barred and armed men standing watch. "We will not share the fate of the cursed," the neighbors shouted from behind their fences. News of the untouched woman and the village's hidden sin had traveled faster than the messengers. Ayami had become a pariah, a place of death that the rest of the world had decided to forget. Inside the village, the silence was absolute, broken only by the dry, hacking coughs of the thirsty. Funk, Kola, Ao, and Tundi walked the dusty paths like the living dead, the villagers' hollowed eyes following them with a mixture of blame and silent pleading. They saw their own reflections in the cracked earth and the muddy river, they were the reason the sky had turned to brass. The pride that had led them to break into Dara's hut was gone, replaced by a devastating realization: the river had stopped giving life because they had proven themselves unworthy of its grace. The village was dying, and the only thing left to harvest was the bitter fruit of their own making. The sun continued to bake the earth of Ayami until the land looked like a shattered mirror of dust and bone. In the heavy, breathless silence of the dying village, the four conspirators gathered at the edge of the stagnant river. They did not need a command from the elders or a shout from the mob. The weight of the terrifying reason was a physical burden that pressed against their chests, making every breath an agony of guilt. Funk looked at Kola, Ao, and Tundi, and for the first time since Dara's arrival, her eyes were clear of jealousy, filled only with a deep, somber understanding. They were the blood debt of an ancient crime, and the river was calling for its payment. "We are the shadow," Funk whispered, her voice rasping in her dry throat. "It is time for the light to return." Without a word of protest, the four began their slow walk toward the muddy banks. The entire village watched from a distance, huddled in the shade of skeletal trees, their faces hollowed by thirst and grief. There was no anger in the crowd now, only a profound, collective sorrow as they realized that the survival of many rested on the sacrifice of the few who had dared to touch what was divine. As Funk and the three men reached the edge of the sludge, the air began to hum with the same low, watery frequency they had heard in Dara's hut. They stepped into the mud, and as the ground yielded beneath them, they did not struggle. They moved with a calm, accepting purpose, walking deeper until the thick silt reached their waists, then their chests. As the mud touched their lips, a cool wind suddenly whipped through the parched palm grove, smelling of rain and distant, deep currents. They closed their eyes, offering their lives to the memory of BC and the spirit of the water, and then, with a final, quiet ripple, the river claimed its own. The silence that followed was broken by a low rumble of thunder that shook the very foundation of the earth. Dark, heavy clouds rushed across the brassy sky, and the first drop of rain hit the dusty ground with the force of a pebble. Then came the deluge. It was a rain so heavy and relentless that it seemed to wash the very memory of the curse from the air. The mud in the riverbed churned and swelled, turning back into a clear, rushing torrent that overflowed its banks, singing a song of rebirth. The villagers ran into the downpour, lifting their faces to the sky and weeping as the cool water soaked their parched skin. But as they drank and danced, the elders stood still, looking toward the river with a new and trembling respect. Ayami was saved, but it was forever changed. The story of Dara was told to every child, a sacred warning passed down through the generations. They taught that a woman's beauty is not a target, her silence is not a secret to be stolen, and her body is not a prize to be won. They learned the hardest lesson of all, that a woman's choice requires no justification, and her refusal is reason enough. And as long as the river flowed, the village remembered that the spirit of the water is always watching, waiting to see if the heart of man has truly learned to honor the light.